I beg the listener's pardon in advance for possible mistakes while reading the text, for slow speech as well as for specific accent. Years without practice cannot help telling on the quality of presentation. The author put for himself the simplest task. Everything must be clear and understandable. Soviet military advisors to SWAPO of Namibia in Lubango, Angola. Time of activity 1977-1989. Looking from inside. Colonial empires started to disintegrate after World War II. The biggest number of sovereign states in Africa, 17, was proclaimed in 1960. This is why this year was declared the Year of Africa. By the middle of the 70s, only one colonial empire, the Portuguese, remained at the continent. After the April Revolution in Portugal in 1974, the events developed swiftly, and the next year the colonial power was forced to grant independence to its former colonies, including Angola. The aim of SWAPO, Southwest Africa People's Organization, later SWAPO of Namibia, founded in 1960, was to get independence for Namibia. Fighting wing of SWAPO, called People's Liberation Army of Namibia, PLAN in English abbreviation, was set up in 1962. First combat clashes with the South African troops took place in 1966. Actually, combat operations could be conducted in the Caprivi Strip, which was bordering on the friendly independent state of Zambia. Also, in 1966, the United Nations annulled the South African mandate on ruling Namibia. New possibilities were opened after proclamation of the People's Republic of Angola on November 11, 1975. For some time after Angola independence, SWAPO maintained neutral relations with the opposition group UNITA, but after several years they went drastically in different directions and became enemies. The MPLA-led government of Angola allowed the creation of the camps of Namibian refugees on the Angolan soil. In the context of the Namibian struggle for independence, sometimes the expressions refugee camp and training center mean the same. Tobias Haineko Training Center was opened at 15-16 kilometers southwest of Lubango in January 1977. It was located in a eucalyptus forest on the road to Umpata, turning to the right. The group of Soviet military advisors to SWAPO formed also in January 1977 and consisting of 16 officers, including 6 interpreters, took an active part in setting up the center. Colonel Yuri Zaputryaev was its commander. Next year, another training center on Kulumbashi was launched in the bush about 30 kilometers north or northeast of Lubango. Apparently in March-April 1978, the Soviet advisors moved from Makonche Hotel, run by the Cuban military, to a separately standing building at a walking distance from Makonje. SWAPO Secretary for Defense Peter Nanyemba played an enormous role in setting up these two important centers. In the Onkulumbashi Center, he organized Operative Command Headquarters, which was a strong underground bunker. Onkulumbashi Training Center could be also called Jumbo Training Center. In many African languages, the word Jumbo or a similar word jamba means elephant or big. The author of the review, Mikhail Istomin, arrived in the People's Republic of Angola on August 31st, 1979, and stayed in the country until June 8, 1981. In the framework of his duties, he functioned as an interpreter of English, Portuguese, and Spanish. The first president of independent Angola, Agostinho Neto, passed away on September 10, immediately after arrival of the author to Lubango. This was the reason of considerable tension in the country and among the Soviet advisors. Depending on the need of the Angolan armed forces in advisors and technicians, the USSR Ministry of Defense dealt with the selection of personnel. The interpreters were of two origins: military by profession and called up to the army from the civilian life. The latter were called up as lieutenants to the armed forces after graduating from the universities of foreign languages with military departments. Those who before studying at the university had served in the military and went to work, say, as teachers at school, were called up as lieutenants, senior lieutenants. The people who studied at the establishments without military departments and had never served in the military were proposed to travel abroad as military interpreters with the employee status in the armed forces. It was not hard to recruit English interpreters, as in Angola there was not big need in them. The interpreters who came to serve 2 or 3 years from the civilian life were mainly lieutenants at the time of the mission and became senior lieutenants of reserve after dismissal from the army. Spanish and Portuguese are kindred but different languages, which should be studied separately. Besides, at that time in the USSR, there were few Portuguese dictionaries, manuals, grammars, and literature in general. In field conditions, it was important to understand, speak, and translate, but this was far from the professional level. Here, I mean the quality of the language training after accelerated courses of the Portuguese language of less than 1 year, which was a typical case for the professional military interpreters. Mixed Spano-Portuguese language, of which one can hear from some of the eyewitnesses, just cannot exist. Apparently, it was a combination of words from these two languages. Portuguese in Angola differs from Portuguese in Portugal and African countries by specific words and accent, intonations. It is interesting that before the departure abroad, the officers received new civilian clothes and footwear from the warehouses of the main department of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the USSR in Moscow. After arrival from the USSR in Luanda, the Soviet officers were transported to the Soviet military mission, from where they were distributed by the military districts and military units of the Angolan Armed Forces, FAPLA. Foreign USSR passports were withdrawn, and instead the newly arrived received an identification card in Portuguese with a photo and stamps of the consular department of the USSR embassy. The author of the review up to now has a certificate with the number M20 in which it is written about the profession of the bearer, Assessor Sovietico, Soviet advisor. For the Angolans, it was a general expression for the Soviet military. The author has not heard about flying from the USSR to Angola and back on the planes of foreign companies. Maybe it was later in the 80s. Aeroflot planes could land in Budapest, Burgas, Brazzaville, and on the way back also in Lusaka. There might have been other airports. From Luanda to Lubango and back, Soviet military and their families flew by military planes with the Soviet crews. Military and political events. During service of the author of the review in Lubango in 1979-1981, there were two chief Soviet military advisors in the People's Republic of Angola, Lieutenant General Vasily Shakhnovich, 1977-1980, and Lieutenant General Georgy Petrovsky, 1980-1982. At the same time, Colonel Nikolai Kurushkin was the head of the Soviet military advisors to SWAPO in Lubango. He was also the advisor to the SWAPO Secretary for Defense, Peter Naniemba. Colonel Vladimir Shaida came to substitute Colonel Nikolai in 1982. Soviet military advisors to SWAPO were directly subordinated to the chief military advisor in Angola. Soviet military advisors to FAPLA, Angolan Armed Forces of the 5th Military District, led by Colonel Vladimir Shishkanov, were also based in Lubango. He was also advisor to the commander of the FAPLA 5th Military District. The heads of both groups were in constant communication on the issues of mutual interest. It should be mentioned that the first Soviet advisors to the FAPLA 5th Military District came to Lubango on October 26, 1976, only 3 months before the arrival of the Soviet military advisors to SWAPO. Such military forces were located in the Lubango area. FAPLA, People's Armed Forces of Liberation of Angola of the 5th Military District. Regiment South of the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Cuba. Groups of Soviet military advisors to FAPLA and SWAPO. Plan, People's Liberation Army of Namibia. In the period under consideration, there existed such facilities of Plan: Tobias Haineko Training Center, Onkulumbashi Training Center, military hospital in the town of Lubango, not far away from the Uila Provincial Hospital. It should be remembered that Namibian mothers with small children and teenagers lived in a refugee camp in the province of Kwanza Sul. The author visited this camp among coffee plants with a group of Soviet military doctors. The trip was made through Luanda. 2 doctors from the German Democratic Republic rendered medical assistance to the Namibian refugees in this camp. The Soviet military advisors to SWAPO included 2 advisors, specialists, technicians of different military specialties, and English interpreters. With few exceptions, they were officers and warrant officers of the Soviet armed forces. The strength of the group varied in the range 25-27 people, with the wives being about 40-45 people. Members of the Communist Party and Young Communist League constituted practically 100% of the group personnel. In the conditions of Angola, this did not have any sense at all, and nobody was involved in any party activities. I cannot remember if any Communist Party meetings were held. The same can be said about the Young Communist League. Tobias Haineko Training Center had at its disposal heavy military equipment: 10 Soviet-made tanks T-34, several armored personnel carriers, and combat reconnaissance patrol vehicles. Namibian combatants were taught to handle the hardware, to drive, to shoot, and to maintain. Infantrymen, artillerymen, sappers and miners, communication and reconnaissance staff were trained at the Onkulumbashi Training Center. Military nurses were trained at the military hospital in Lubango. Preparation in all specialties was conducted in Russian with translation into English and with additional translation into Kwanyama, a language relating to the Ovamba language group. In addition to teaching at the courses of military nurses, the Soviet doctors treated sick and wounded SWAPO combatants at the hospital as well as the camps. The People's Liberation Army of Namibia was first confronted by the South African Defence Force (SADF) and South African Police (SAP), which from August 1st, 1980 were reorganized on the territory of Namibia into the South West Africa Territorial Force (SWATF) and Southwest Africa Police (SWAPO), respectively. At the end of the 70s, the total strength of the South African Army in Namibia was reportedly as high as 60,000 men. In the course of military actions, some army battalions were notorious. First of all, the 32nd Battalion Buffalo, 700 men mainly of Angolan origin, and 101st Battalion, as well as the police force Koevoet, Koevoet, translated from Afrikaans as crowbar, formed in June 1979. The last two units consisted in 80% of the black Namibians from the Ovambo tribe. As for the Koevoet, its strength quickly grew to 3,000 men. The first condition for enlisting was to know English or the language of the Boers, Afrikaans. The salary and other privileges were so attractive that it was not easy to join the force, even knowing the required languages. On the other hand, SWAPO guerrillas punished by death the Namibian traitors from Koevoet at the first opportunity. There was good reason for such special treatment of the countrymen by the SWAPO fighters. It is considered that 80% of the losses in personnel were inflicted on the plan precisely by Koevoet. Moreover, the balance of losses was considerably in favor of the police formation. The strength of the Southwest Africa Territorial Force quickly rose to 21,000 men. The above-mentioned units were the shock force in fighting the planned guerrillas. It should be clear that the local army and police in Southwest Africa remained closely integrated into the corresponding structures of South Africa. One can find on the internet that the strength of the People's Liberation Army of Namibia by the end of the war in 1989 was as high as 32,000 men. It should be mentioned that about 11,000 people, SWAPO guerrillas, members of the security forces and civilians died during the armed conflict from 1966 until 1989. The population of the country rose from 735,000 people in 1966 to 1,386,000 people in 1989. There were 1,057,000 people in Namibia in 1980. The losses should be compared with the number of the inhabitants apparently from 1978. The original population of the Uila province is represented by the tribe Nyaneka Umbe. The group of Muila in it is known by the photos of semi-naked women with traditional adornments. Nyaneka Umbe people were only distant relatives to the Ovambo tribe, constituting the bulk of SWAPO. The Ovambo tribe, specifically its groups of Kwanyama and Donga, live in Angola only at the extreme south. As to the tribal composition of SWAPO, one can also mention Herero, Nama, and Damara. The latter two use clicking languages like the Bushmen, Sand tribe. The author of the review has not seen at the camps the whites and the Bushmen. The plant men lived in the tents, huts, or in dugouts. In winter time, in June, July, and August, at night the temperature could drop to zero. That is why clothes, warm clothes, and sleeping accessories were very important. In general, one can say that Lubango and its surroundings were a very comfortable place for life at the height of 1,700 meters above sea level. In the camps, there was a net of trenches for personnel and shelters for military hardware. Such installations could considerably diminish the losses from the airstrikes and would be very useful to repulse land operations of the enemy. I remember that in field conditions, the Namibians cleaned their teeth with twigs of certain trees with the bark removed. It is hard to say how many Namibian fighters were based in the two camps simultaneously. Maybe it was 2,000–3,000. According to the South African data, in 1978, the total plant strength was up to 16,000 men. These figures seem to be too high. Plant supplies with foodstuffs were very limited. Once during one of the crises, the commander Nikolai Kurushkin discussed with Peter Nanyemba the possibility of hunting an elephant in the bush to alleviate the problem. I do not remember how the situation was solved. The commander knew English, understood and spoke it, but often used the services of an interpreter to have time to think, especially at the official events. He could also correct the translation. During the week, the Soviet officers traveled for the service to one of the SWAPO camps and returned home before lunch. It is interesting to note that each morning at the officers' meeting, one of the interpreters presented political information, including on the news of the South African radio. Especially impressive it was on June 8, 1980, the next day after the South African air raid on the Tobias Haineko Training Center. It is surprising for a Soviet man not to recall if there was a commander's deputy on political matters in the group. The author of the review contacted with the Cubans in the canteen of the Makoncha Hotel. I remember there was a sergeant called by the Russians Kusa because it was impossible for him to pronounce the Russian word kushat, to eat, because of the sh sound. I was also involved in the translation of discussions between the group commander as well as the chief of staff with the commander and chief of staff of the Cuban regiment South. I have forgotten their names. From September 1979 until June 81, the People's Liberation Army of Namibia did not have Cuban or East German instructors, what one could hear from the South African propaganda. Also, there was neither Cuban nor Angolan aircraft at the Lubango airport. It could not occur to any Soviet citizen, let alone military, to cross over into Namibia with the SWAPO fighters, although one can find it mentioned in the memoirs for effect. Due to the activity of the South African Army and police, the planned guerrillas could infiltrate Namibia at a relatively small depth, up to 250 kilometers, roughly speaking up to Oshivelo. East, the movement was constrained by the area of the Ovambo tribe. A big city, Tsumeb, is located at 350 kilometers from the border. The distances are taken from the town of Ongiva in Angola. They can be shorter depending on the place of entry. For conducting military operations, the planned combatants were transported to the border at night time, mainly on the trucks IFA W50 produced in East Germany and Scania produced in Sweden, later infiltrating into Namibia. Due to the weight limitations, they could carry only small arms, grenade launchers, mines, bazookas, sometimes portable anti-aircraft missile systems, Strela 2M, with a range of 4.2 kilometers and range in height of 2.3 kilometers. Peter Nanyemba, Secretary for Defense, traveled on a high open Jeep Volvo. Accompanying the commander of the group, the author once visited the central office of SWAPO in Luanda. I have forgotten about the reason for the visit. It was quite a surprise how quickly the typists did their work, typing even the texts in Cyrillic using Roman letters. I translated for Sam Nujoma only once when he visited the commander of the group, Colonel Nikolai Kurushkin. Soviet military advisors to SWAPO filled up their vehicles at one of the FAPLA gas stations in the town on the way to the Onkulumbashi camp. SWAPO transport got the fuel at the same station. One time in the second half of 1980, a serious conflict flared up between the Angolan authorities and the SWAPO. The Angolans demanded the Namibian vehicles to be filled up outside the town, being afraid of the South African airstrikes. Both the SWAPO leadership and the Soviet advisors understood that militarily South Africa could not be defeated. Due to this reason, the main emphasis was on the harassing attacks and formation of the National Army for the case of the political solution of the conflict, and this actually happened. Namibia proclaimed its independence on March 21, 1990. It is worthwhile mentioning that Soviet military advisors to SWAPO did not have any relation to the political processes both in the party and its armed wing plan. Moreover, they could not in any way deal with the counter-espionage activities within plan. During the service in 1979-1981, the author did not hear about any persons detained by the SWAPO authorities. However, after returning home in 1981, somebody from the former colleagues informed that a spy network had been exposed within SWAPO. There was no more information as new Soviet personnel unknown to the author came to SWAPO. The author found out only recently about supposedly numerous spies detained in the SWAPO camps until 1989. Theoretically, there could be spies and they might have existed in reality. It is not known exactly how many there were. It is not known for sure if someone was executed. And the main aspect is whether these people were real spies or not. It is very unlikely that they were political opponents. There could not have been classical cohorts in the SWAPO camps. Such doubts led to the result of only 57% for SWAPO in the first elections held in November 1989 instead of the expected two-thirds majority. During my service, such military events happened in the Lubango area. On September 26, 1979, 4 aircraft Mirage F-3 and 1 aircraft Buccaneer SMK-50 of the South African Air Force mistakenly attacked with bombs and rockets a furniture factory, Madeira de Huila, and located nearby a FAPLA warehouse at the outskirts of Lubango, resulting in the destruction of the facilities and death of 26 people, 29 people by a different source. On October 28, 1979, on Sunday, groups of South African saboteurs disembarked in the afternoon from the helicopters Puma and Alouette 3, undermined the railway link between Mozambique, called Namibi, from 1982 and Lubango, west of Lubango, undermining also the bridges at the Serpentine Road twisting in the Sierra da Leba mountain range. Enemy actions were also reported to take place at the railroad east of Lubango in the area of Dongo. In the course of the raid, 20 civilians were killed at the Serpentine Road. The bridges were repaired during 3 months by the Soviet bridge building team based in Lubango. The distance between the Namibian border and Lubango is 385 kilometers, so it is quite probable that the South African Special Forces installed a temporary base somewhere in the bush. It was on this day that the Soviet military advisors to FAPLA from the headquarters of the 5th Military District, together with the advisors from the Angolan brigades who came to a conference, traveled to Mozambique to the sea, Atlantic Ocean. Other Soviet specialists working in civilian area joined the military. The medicine-related specialists went in their minibus, presumably to collect medicines. It is only natural that the wives travel together with their men. The distance between Lubango and Mozambique is 180 kilometers. On the way back, it started to get darker when approaching the Serpentine Road. It must have been 5:30 p.m. 2 cars from the column went ahead, one of them with the medics. There were some flares over Serpentine with the helicopters flying at a distance. Nobody gave special attention to these events. The saboteurs opened fire at the approaching cars, but the smaller Lada car managed to turn around and warn the approaching column. The minibus of the medics was riddled with bullets. All returned to Mozambique and the next day were brought to Lubango by plane. The cars were driven to Lubango by the old road. It is not quite clear what happened to the medics. They could not reach Lubango as the road was undermined and the column could hardly wait for them. They must have gone on foot to Mozambique the entire night. The advisors to the 5th Military District headquarters had pistols, and the advisors from the brigades were armed with submachine guns, pistols, and grenades. They could hardly sustain a combat with the South African Special Forces. If they had been captured alive, it would have been a tremendous success to the South African commandos. The Soviet advisors were not hunted upon, and the enemy could not know they went to Mosamedish. At that time, there was practically no surveillance from the space. Moreover, they could find space in the helicopters only for a pair of the high-ranking officers. Sometimes these events are described as if they had happened in 1980. That night, the Soviet military advisors to SWAPO did not sleep, getting ready to repulse the enemy attack. The group commander, Colonel Nikolai, said at the evening meeting at the end of his brief report, "Stand to death." Nobody knew what it was about. Neither machine guns nor grenades were given to the interpreters, unpractical in military matters. Earlier, the Soviet advisors to SWAPO with wives also visited Mosamedish at the Atlantic Ocean. The author of the review remained in Lubango by chance. After October 28, everybody understood that it was not a game, and family trips to the sea stopped forever. The author went to Mosamedish only once in a column of 2 cars, Volga Gaz-24 of the commander and UAZ military car with officers. The departure was early in the morning, and the return took place in the afternoon before dark. There was no need in the service of the interpreter. I have forgotten about the purpose of the trip. On May 1st or 2nd, 1980, the South African saboteurs undermined drainage system at the railroad Mosamedish-Lubango. The helicopters flew away, but 2 men, a white South African and a black Angolan, began their hard trip to the Haineko training center. Precisely this team made the reconnaissance at the terrain and directed the South African Air Force at the eucalyptus forest. On June 6, 1980, 6 Mirage F-3 fighter planes of the South African Air Force, according to the above spies, it was Buccaneer and Canberra aircraft, hit the Namibian refugee camp, actually Tobias Haineko Training Center. The bombs fell on the football field. A plant company went by its edge about 2 minutes before. Soviet officers traveling home in a car for lunch saw the marching company as they were very near. 3 Namibian fighters sacrificed. The author of the review saw personally from the yard of the Soviet mission in Lubango, approximately it was at noon or maybe at 30 minutes past noon, how the Cuban air defense launched several Pichora missiles at the aircraft. The Angolans reported that 3 of them had been brought down. The next day, the South Africans told in the news that all the aircraft had returned safely to their base. Later on, they finally recognized that 2 of the planes had been hit and damaged, and the pilots managed to land them miraculously. The Pichora missiles explode while approaching the target. Even 2 missiles exploded near one of the planes. This episode was a signal for constructing a bomb shelter at the other side of the Soviet mission brick fence. Air defense system S-125M M1A Pichora was being deployed in Lubango from September 1979. Its battery, consisting of a missile launcher, command post and radar, was located at top of the mountain near the Christ the King statue rising above Lubango. Judging by the results, all was ready by June 1980. The Pichora missile system functioned at the distance from 3.5 to 25 kilometers. It could not be used at short distances. Later on, a more advanced air defense system, Cube, was installed in Lubango and other big towns in the south of Angola. Its radar functioned at 65 kilometers. If the conflict had continued, the South African aircraft could not have entered the airspace of Angola. Here one should mention that the air defense system S-125M1A Pichora near the Christ the King statue were covered by the air defense self-propelled guns Shilka in the Cuban regiment based near the airport. On June 8, 1980, a plane Yak-40 of the Angolan airline TAG was brought down by friendly fire near the population center Matala, 175 kilometers east of Lubango. All the passengers and a crew of 3 Soviet citizens died. The military were very nervous after the South African raid on the SWAPO camp near Lubango on June 7. It must be in the second half of 1980 when the South African Air Force hit the Namibian refugee camp on Kulumbashi, actually a training center, north or northeast of Lubango. Several SWAPO fighters sacrificed. The author personally saw the body of one of the killed fighters. Cynically as it may sound, such efforts and dangers experienced by the South African Air Force were not worth such modest results. The operative command headquarters of Plan, with Peter Nanyemba at the top, was located in this camp. He was Secretary for Defense, Defense Minister of SWAPO. Due to the proximity of the South African enemy, such headquarters could not be positioned directly at the border. Apparently, this was the case when the South African aircraft used for the success of the raid a civilian plane making its landing at Lubango airport. There were suppositions that the enemy used different holes in the radar operation. Also, the South African pilots knew that low altitudes could be a salvation in the course of such operations. It was not possible to find any additional information on this air raid. Angola did not provide official data if the airstrikes and hostile actions on land did not concern its own armed forces. On October 10, 1980, planned combatants by 2 shots of the shoulder-fired Strela 2M missiles brought down Impala Mk2 aircraft of the South African Air Force near population center Mupa, south of Lubango and closer to the border. The pilot landed by parachute and shot back with a machine gun with small caliber cartridges until he died. His guns and equipment were brought to the headquarters of the 5th Military District of Fapla. I do not remember about the body. The head of the Soviet advisor to SWAPO, Colonel Nikolai, was invited to have a look. The commander took the of the review with him as a Portuguese interpreter. After the South African Terrorist Act on November 6-8, 1982 at the railroad Namib-Lubango and at the Serpentine Road Namib-Lubango, a plan unit was positioned at the mountain foot to prevent further enemy attacks. Surprisingly, this was done only in 1982. Similar operation of the South African commandos was conducted as early as October 28, 1979. Practically all supplies of the FAPLA 5th and 6th military districts, Cuban Army and SWAPO went through the port of Namibia. Serious combats between FAPLA and the South African Army began between the border and Lubango in the population centers Kahama, Shangongo, Onjiva in August 1981. This was the enemy Operation Protea, bearing the name of the national flower of South Africa. At this time, the author was not present in the country. I heard after returning home that some officers of the group were decorated with state awards in connection with these events. All the officers, advisors, technicians and interpreters wore the same military clothes: camouflage shirt, camouflage trousers, military khaki-colored sweater, white military belt of something like rigid canvas, and military laced boots with two small buckles in the upper part. For the night duties, there were camouflage pea jackets of the same time as the shirts and the trousers. First, we used as headwear a green beret with black lining and FAPLA bands, and then a camouflage military cap with a visor. There were no insignias on the uniform. All the officers had personal weapons: AK-47, AKM or AKM-MS machine guns, and TT or Makarov pistols. The memory did not preserve information on the source of the uniforms and weapons. Conditions of life of Soviet advisors. Soviet military arrived in Lubango as a rule without family, and later, if a room was available, summoned wives, sometimes with children. There was a Soviet school in Lubango where children of both Soviet military and civilian specialists studied. The officers serving in Plan lived near the center of Lubango in a 5-story building. Water pressure at higher stocks was very low, especially at daytime. It was not practically possible to take a bath. Due to this reason, the commander of the group, Colonel Nikolai Kurushkin, made a wise decision to construct a real Russian bathhouse. From the street, one could enter the internal yard through a wide passage also intended for the cars. The level of the yard was practically one stock lower than the level of the street. Here there were 2 rooms for the officers' meetings and for the officers on duty. At the opposite side of the yard, under a canopy covered with the slate sheets, there was a parking place for automobiles. UAZ military jeeps, passenger car GAZ-24 Volga, white Land Rover with 8 passenger seats and a right-hand drive Toyota pickup. Left side traffic has existed in Namibia. The cars had Angolan plate numbers, but the author forgot which. On the right of the garage, there was something like cinema hall, where Soviet films were shown on a regular basis. On the left, behind the armored personnel carrier 60 PB, presented by the Cubans after the events in Kasinga on May 4, 1978, there was a passage to the vegetable gardens and a volleyball court. The door, several meters to the right of the passage, led to the bathhouse. The building and the yard were surrounded on all sides by a brick fence, except from the street. In order to supply water to the households and the bathhouse, an enormous tank, maybe for 5,000 liters, was installed in the yard. Also, 2 sealed boxes from the Pechora missiles were buried in the yard for collecting water. The officers on duty were responsible for filling the boxes with water. They also took care of heating the water for the bathhouse on the male and female days. Eucalyptus wood was used in the burner located on the back of the bathhouse. It is on the side of the vegetable gardens. One vegetable garden was a plot of land of 2 by 2 meters. A bomb shelter of concrete constructions was built immediately across the brick fence of the vegetable gardens. In case of a call from the Cuban regiment to the officer on duty with the code word 555, 555, the officer hit the artillery shell and all the people in the house had to run to the bomb shelter. The procedure was actually repeated several times. Probably in the spring of 1980, the Cubans installed Pechora air defense system with radar and knew when enemy aircraft were approaching. The pilots saw in their indicators that the radar was following them and knew that getting into the field of action of Pechora could cause them big problems, to put it mildly. The author of the review knew only one movie in Lubango called Arco-Iris, Rainbow, visited only once by the military advisors to SWAPO at the beginning of my mission. I forgot why I had not gone there. Officers with wives had their meals at home, and bachelors went for lunch and dinner to the canteen in the Makonji hotel run by the Cuban military. There were several sources of food for the Soviet advisors in Lubango. Small quantity of vegetables from the tiny vegetable gardens. Purchases from the Angolan shops, fazendas and factories. Payment was made with the local currency kwanza. Soviet long-term storage foodstuffs were brought monthly from the Soviet shop in Luanda. The goods were assessed in US dollars. Periodically, Soviet-Spanish joint venture company Sovispan supplied from the Canary Islands various vegetables, fruits and long-term storage foodstuffs. Vegetables and fruits were consumed mainly in Luanda. Sovispan company was extremely popular because of different industrial goods in the offer: tape recorders, cassettes, earphones, watches, cameras, clothes, footwear, cosmetics, linen, bed covers, etc. The goods were assessed in US dollars. Alcoholic drinks and beer were available from the Soviet shop and from Sovispan. One could also buy Angolan beer, Ngola, at the Lubango factory. I have not heard about any strong alcoholic drinks produced in Lubango. The smokers used cigarettes from both shops above as well as of Angolan manufacture, as Baia, Senador, SL, AC, Herminius, and even Frances without filter. One can recall female exchanges with the Angolan women of different goods, mainly foodstuffs, for fruits and vegetables. The author had to teach the female part of the group simple words and phrases in Portuguese. Banknotes of 20, 50, 100, 500 and 1000 kwanzas as well as the coins of 50 lei, 1, 2, 5, 10, and 20 kwanzas circulated in Angola at that time. The official rate of kwanza in July 1981 to the US dollar was 27 kwanzas and 63 lei for 1 US dollar. It did not vary much until the beginning of 1993. Black market might exist in Rwanda. It should be added here that a rigid rationing system for basic agricultural and industrial goods was in force in Angola. Both civilian and military specialists from the USSR could buy some goods from the shops, warehouses, and factories at the government prices. But anyway, in some cases, it was necessary to negotiate. It should be mentioned that an enormous number of fruits, both of domestic and wild, grow in Angola, which remained unexplored for the majority of Soviets. During the mission of the husbands, many wives knitted macrame from sisal, natural coarse fiber obtained from the leaves of Agava sisolana. The salary in the foreign currency rubles was paid monthly, with the sum in US dollars being calculated according to the official rate of the ruble. Interpreters and other officers received 450 foreign currency rubles, and warrant officers got slightly less. I do not know about advisors. On the territory of Angola, the dollar expenses were deducted from the salary converted into dollars. I am aware of such expenses. Local currency kwanza for 50 US dollars, Communist Party and Young Communist League dues, subscription to the Soviet newspapers and journals, purchases from the Soviet trading company, rather store, based in Luanda, and of course spending with the Sovispan company. In order to avoid questions, spending level at the shop was recommended to be kept at about 100 US dollars per month. The remaining sum in dollars was converted back into the foreign currency rubles, and after this converted into the concrete notes in the form of внешпосылторг checks. One could receive them at the accounting department of the military mission before going to the USSR. The sums were not small, or better to say, were big, and the people were afraid of traveling with such money. Although Angola was considered to be a country with the salaries backed by US dollars, the ordinary military were not allowed to open accounts at the Внешторг Bank of the USSR, with the exception of advisors, those generals and officers who held the position of advisors. It was much easier for the Soviet civilian specialists. They could get not only checks at the bank in Moscow, but also US dollars before traveling abroad. In the USSR, the owners of the checks could purchase goods in short supply in special Berezka shops located in major cities, but mostly in Moscow. If an officer was not married or his wife was not with him abroad, then, along with the внешпосылторг checks, he received traveler checks, which one could exchange at the Sheremetyevo airport in Moscow into Soviet rubles. The scheme was not complicated. If the final salary in the foreign currency rubles was, say, 400 rubles, then 20% was deducted, which you could get later in the Soviet rubles at 1-to-1 ratio via the traveler's checks, with the remaining 320 currency rubles converted to the внешпосылторг checks at the rate 4.6 checks for 1 currency ruble. So there was a considerable financial interest in the wife's availability. Medical attention was not a problem in the group of Soviet military advisors to SWAPO, as it included military and civilian doctors except a dentist. For a long time, the author had a mercury feeling done by a Cuban military doctor working in the center of the town. As to the intestinal infections, there was no cholera or amoebiasis here, and malaria. Lubango was a very favorable town. It should be also added that there were mainly healthy and strong men in the group. In 1980, we learned that a Soviet officer was brought from the south, Kama, Shangongo or Onjiva, to the Lubango hospital, diagnosed cerebral malaria. We also heard the expression cerebral edema. He was unconscious and the doctors could not do anything. With big difficulties, the patient was evacuated to Luanda and then to Moscow. It is not known if he survived or not. Even if he survived, the health implications could be very severe. For the author, it became known only at present that the name of the malaria patient was Lieutenant Colonel Pyotr Perov. Difficulties with the medicine's delivery and evacuation of the officer to Luanda were due to the fact that the events were taking place just after the South African air attack at the SWAPO camp on June 7, 1980. For some time, military and civilian planes did not fly, and the Cuban air defense was on the nerves. There was no television and TV sets in Lubango. Washing machines and air conditioning was also unknown. Refrigerators stood in the kitchens. The food was cooked at the gas stove with the gas coming from a small metal bottle, garrafa. We had to buy such bottles regularly from the state oil company Sonangol. I do not remember if we slept under mosquitoes' nets or not. The hair was cut by someone from the Soviet colleagues. There were no problems with electricity supplies. It was supplied to Lubango and surroundings as well as to Mossamedesh from hydropower station on the Kunene River at the Matala population center, 175 kilometers east of Lubango. The difference in level at the river there was 20 meters. A group of Soviet energy power engineers was located at the Matala hydropower station in 1984, but probably it was there earlier. Up to now, a separate power system exists at the south of Angola. Drinking water was supplied from underground sources. The problem was only with insufficient pressure for higher buildings. Telephone calls to the USSR using international lines were not possible. In case of emergency, the connection could be established from the embassy or from a Soviet ship. Communication with friends and relatives was carried out by correspondence through the post box of the Soviet Defense Ministry. Moscow 400, military post number 515L. The Angolans received their correspondence at the P.O. box at the post office. There have not been any postmen in Angola in the European meaning of the word. There were no post codes in the country, and they aren't now. The people know the urban center more by the name of the district, Bairro, rather than by the name of the street. In 1980, an officer arrived to the group who was accommodated alone in a room at the top floor. According to the rumors, a radio set for direct communication with the USSR was installed there. During 6 months presence, he was not allowed to leave the territory of the mission. Another officer came to substitute him after 6 months. Usual time of serving abroad was 2 years, with possible extension to 3 years. The officer with the official position advisor had special conditions for the mission duration. As to the holidays leave, in the old calendar belonging to the author, it is marked September 19, November 19, 1980. It is hard to believe now that the leave actually lasted 2 months. In addition to the Soviet advisors, I heard about existence in the town of Soviet military topographers, doctors, bridge builders who lived near the mission of the Soviet military advisors to Fapla, and Uzbek agriculture specialists in Umpata. The Soviet pioneers to SWAPO from January 1977 apparently until the spring of 1978 lived in the Makonje hotel run by the Cuban military at Patrice Lumumba Street, Laje district. It has high ground floor, 5 floors, and covered viewing place at the top. Later, the bachelors of the group had their lunch and dinner at the ground floor canteen. Bachelors were real bachelors as well as those to whom the wives did not come yet. Presently, a food store, Casa Boni, is located at the ground floor of the former hotel, with the higher floors converted into living premises. One can find on the internet the picture of Makonji. The length of the Patrice Lumumba Street is only 301 meters. Soviet military advisors to SWAPO lived in a 5-story building with 2 entrances at Deolinda Rodriguez Street, District 14th of April, 14 de Abril. At the ground floor from the street there was a room, barracks for the Angolan guards with whom the author communicated rather often. Sometimes fish was brought from Massabedesh to the fish shop next door. At the end of 1980, abandoned rooms at the ground floor facing the street were renovated for the bachelors. In order to reach the flat, one must use the external spiral staircase from the yard. Each family had a separate room and several bachelors lived in one room. After departure of the advisors to the USSR, the Angolan authorities provided accommodation in this building to the needy citizens. Lubango Military Hospital is located across the road from the former Soviet mission. A fast food establishment, Cantina do Benfica, is in the neighboring building. The length of the street Deolinda Rodriguez is 1 kilometer, 930 meters. It should be underlined that the author of the review was lucky with the people in the group of the Soviet military advisors to SWAPO in Lubango. I would like to single out the commander of the group, Colonel Nikolai Kurushkin, and head of staff, Colonel Vladimir Grechnev, possessing high professional and human qualities. I often translated for them. I am still thankful to the wife of the advisor, Colonel Ivan Zherlitsyn, who gave me valuable advice on acquiring a flat for the Внешпосылторг checks. Especially, this can be appreciated by the people who were registered in the countryside. It was hard to get urban registration, let alone to get own domicile. Colonel Zherlitsyn produced an impression of a thoughtful and intelligent man. He was the second commander of the Soviet military advisors to SWAPO before the arrival of Colonel Nikolai Kurushkin. The author recorded the names of 37 colleagues. The names of several interpreters who came during my last months of the mission I do not remember, and they are not in the list. They were not from Kharkov, and all of them were English interpreters with no connection to Portuguese or Spanish. Different additional information. It should be mentioned that in the context of this review, very often the words SWAPO and plan are synonyms. On Kulumbashi Training Center, to be exact, Omugulu Gombashe or Ongolumbashe was named in honor of the population center at the north of Namibia, where the first combat of the People's Liberation Army of Namibia with the South African troops took place in 1966. Tobias Haineko Training Center was named in honor of the first plant commander who died in combat in 1967. The General Assembly of the United Nations on June 12, 1968 renamed Southwest Africa into Namibia, and SWAPO was recognized as the sole legitimate representative of the Namibia's people. This decision was actually confirmed by the parliamentary elections in November 1989. Independence of Namibia was proclaimed on March 21, 1990. It is interesting that according to the Constitution of 1992, the People's Republic of Angola became just Republic of Angola. From 1975 until 1991, the 10th main department of the General Staff of the USSR Armed Forces sent to Angola on mission 10,985 generals, admirals, officers, warrant officers, and common soldiers. 54 Soviet citizens have not returned home from Angola, with 45 being military officers. In contrast to Afghanistan, in the People's Republic of Angola, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Cuba were at the front edge of the war from 1975 until 1991. Officially, 2,289 Cubans died in combat actions, with the non-combat losses being still higher. Soviet Russian military presence ended in 1992. On December 22, 1988, Angola, Cuba, and South Africa signed in New York trilateral agreements foreseeing granting independence to Namibia and discontinuing direct participation of foreign armed forces in combat actions on the territory of Angola. The town of Lubango was founded in 1885 by Portuguese settlers from the island of Madeira. From 1980 to 2021, the population of the town rose more than 10 times, from 69,000 to 871,000 people. The main tourist attractions in Lubango and its surroundings are as follows. Automobile road serpentine across the mountain range Serra da Leba between the provinces Huila and Namibe was built by a Portuguese engineer in 1915 and modernized in 1969-1974. The beginning of the pass is located at 37 kilometers southwest of Lubango. The length of the serpentine is about 20 kilometers with a height difference of 1 kilometer. According to different data, there are from 19 to 42 turns. An old road between the Atlantic Ocean and Lubango, inconvenient in many aspects, exists across the mountain range. On the internet, one can find huge number of awesome photos taken from the viewing place. 2. Abyss Gorge Tundavala is located at 18 kilometers northwest of Lubango. Tundavala is a nearly vertical 1,200 meters rock at the mountain range Serra da Leba. In terms of the height difference, it is actually similar to the Serpentine Road at Serra da Leba. A great view is opened up from the viewing place. 3. The statue of Christ the King of 30 meters dominating Lubango was built in 1957 from white marble. There exist only 4 such statues in the world. 4. The Recreation and Amusement Park Nossa Senhora do Monte is located lower the chapel built in 1921 at the mountain slope and is dedicated to the patroness of the town with the same name, which can be translated as the Chapel of Our Lady of the Mountain. Presently, Angola has cellular telephone service provided by Unitel, private company with 80% of the market, and Movicel, subsidiary of the state company Angola Telecom with 20% of the market, as well as fixed communication lines of Angola Telecom. To call a cell phone number from abroad, one should dial +244, number of the cellular phone service from 3 digits, and subscriber number. To call a fixed communication number, one dials +244, then code of the town. In Lubango it is 61 and subscriber number. For calling inside Angola, digit 2 is dialed additionally before the town code. In 2021, monthly payment for internet is around $50 US. $1 is equal to approximately 600 kwanzas. Now, 40% of the Angolans use Portuguese at home. In Luanda, this number exceeds 70%. Among national languages, one can single out Umbundu, Kimbundu, and Kikongo, used in the tribes of Imbundu, Ambundu, and Congo, respectively. Without Portuguese language and local culture based on the Portuguese language, Angola could not exist as a state. When compiling a review, in addition to his memory, the author used various sources on the internet, with the most important apparently being the site of the Angola Veterans Union.